So my name is Alan Ket. Everybody knows me as Ket. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York City. I'm an 80s kid, so growing up in New York, I grew up really loving hip-hop, falling in love with the graffiti that was on the trains at the time. I was forced to ride the trains to and from high school in the mid-80s, and there was no way I could get around seeing it, and I loved it. Also, growing up in Brooklyn, it was everywhere. And so in high school is when I really first met the first real writers, guys that would go into trains and layups and things like that to actually paint the train. By that time, in 1984, I had already fallen in love with everything having to do with the art movement, because I got to see incredible whole cars and burners on the trains. And so I ended up really finally discovering what it was all about once I met the first writers. Once that happened, I was hooked, and I wanted to know more about it. I wanted to know the stories. I wanted to know who each artist was, and I started to get involved. I started to document it. I started to take pictures of what was happening on the trains, and then the next step was going to paint the trains. So when I first met writers like Ven and Ghost, I had just started to go paint trains by myself, and I got down with those guys, and that was it. The rest was history. I started painting, every day, or as much as I possibly could, and that was 1987. And since then, I've been thoroughly hooked. It's been a major part of my life, and even at times when it's been a minor point in my life, it's always been present. So, of course, like anybody else, I stuck to it, and I developed. I got better as a painter, and I painted as much as I possibly could, and that's how I got into it. That's how I got down with the movement.
What were the names of some of the first artists that you fell in love with?
Yeah, I remember the first names that I saw. I mean, in my neighborhood, it was OE3 and Atom, ATOM. They were up everywhere. Atom had burners everywhere. I fell in love with his work. One of the biggest works that I remember seeing was a Heck 398 handball court. It's in the inside of, I think, spray can art. That was in my neighborhood, so I saw that every day going to and from school or just walking around.
What's the neighborhood?
Williamsburg, Brooklyn. On the trains, I remember seeing Webb burners on the J line and Kev TM7, and those were incredible burners. And then when I transferred trains to go to school, I would see Scene and Zoom trains and PJ on the 5s and 6s, and those blew me away. On the 5s, I used to see things from Doc, TC5 crew, and those guys were it. When I saw those guys work, I was blown away. I used to follow the trains if I didn't get a better look at it. Duster, those guys, I used to follow those trains just so I could see it, to see what the hell it said, because I couldn't read it. It was going by too fast. And seeing the 6 trains, they were cleaning the 6 trains at the time, but I got to see some incredible work on the 6s and the 5s and the 3s. I used to go all the way out to East New York to look at the 3 trains, just to see who was painting on them. I'd see work from Duro and Doc and Webb. My home line didn't have a lot of incredible artwork, other than when Webb decided to paint them. And then Reese, I used to start seeing Reese up, and Mesh, and Ven, and it was incredible. I didn't have to go to an art gallery. I just had to wait for my train to come in or sit on the platform, and I would see pieces of art coming in every few minutes from artists from all over the city, and that was an incredible time. When I did my first piece on a train, I had gone to do a piece by myself in an old layup on Canal Street, and that was my home line. It was a J line, so I went to paint a train, and Ghost and Reese showed up while I was painting, and we had already met on a few occasions, and we were cool, and they decided to paint next to me, and so I ended up doing my first piece on a train. It was with those guys, and my second piece on the train was also with those guys, and it was a very special thing with me. For me rather. I got down with AOK and Riss very early on, just because I would, hung out and happened to bump into them in the layup and paint with them. And back then, It was still hot. You know, cops would raid layups. You know, guys would get arrested. But where I grew up in my neighborhood, it wasn't hot, and you know, people painted, you know, fairly freely. So I painted in my neighborhood for years, out in the open, on handball courts, on walls. Cops didn't really care. You know, people in the neighborhood would give you permission to paint, or you know, there were other things to worry about. You know, crack was in full swing. So with the crack epidemic, crack kids running wild, graffiti writers are not really high on the priority list for people to arrest. And yeah, that was it. I mean, for me, it was you know, paying my first trains and getting down with those guys. But you know, there was no problem at the time. Late 80s, no problem. Early 90s, things got hotter, but we were still able to do what we needed to do. Sure, we, you know, run from the cops or whatever, but at least, you know, that was on the trains. But in my neighborhood, it was chill, it was cool, and people, you know, people admired my work and respected me, and the police didn't really care.